Hey everyone, so welcome back to the Beth and Deb show. I am Beth.
I'm Deb.
And we have a really amazing guest with us today. Chera LaForge is one of our amazing colleagues at Indiana University East, where both Deb and I are on faculty. And it has sort of come to us that, the upcoming election, after we have sort of already been in this state of kind of emotional, lots of emotion, turmoil, unrest. We could fill in the blank there, right? Where we've been just really emotional these last 6 months or so, that Deb and I wanted to gather an expert who can talk with us about this upcoming election, and also for Deb and I to share some expertise on how to keep yourself from sort of feeling really overwhelmed during this election season. So, Deb, was there anything else that came to mind as you were thinking about, hey, we should talk about this with folks? And Chera's the right person too.
Yeah, well, I just know personally that I'm really dreading this next 3 to 4 weeks. Personally, just trying to keep my inner panic at a minimum because there's just so much going on. It's yes, this election is a huge thing, but it seems like there's just so much chaos swirling around it, and the political arena is just blowing up, and I don't have training in political stuff. So Chera is our resident go-to expert. So I think she's a great choice for us to talk to today about what do the experts think? What people who know more about politics than I do, what is going on here?
Yeah, so Chera, I know we were kind of chatting about what you could share with us today. And I know that you've probably been talking about this so much with folks. So what can you tell us about being sort of a good consumer of media information as we are selecting candidates, dealing with, I know you're not necessarily the expert on emotion, but you had some good ideas for how to just manage just all of it. So give us what you got, and maybe share something a little bit about you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I love being on the Beth and Deb show. It's my first time, so it's very exciting after watching so many of your videos. I am an associate professor of political science. I've been at IU East since 2012, which means that I started in the midst of a presidential election. And now, so this is my third one at IU East. It's my first year because of COVID, not really being on the ground with a lot of students. In a normal year, we'd be having events and all kinds of other stuff that goes along with it. And also teaching. I usually teach a campaigns and elections course in the fall of presidential years. And I actually passed on it this year, partly because of my mental health, because it's increasingly difficult to teach that class. So I definitely understand people who have election stress right now. And one of the things you kind of mentioned that we are in a period of pretty high stress just in general with the pandemic and with things like the racial protests this summer. But we have sort of been in a weird political cycle for much longer than that. People always talk to me and they're like, oh, it must be so exciting to be a political scientist right now. And most political scientists are like, no, it's actually really exhausting. Because I would tell people that I would be able to, when I first started, maybe not pay attention to the news for 3 or 4 days at a time, the political news, because things pretty much happened as you would expect them to happen. Maybe Congress wouldn't be in session and there wouldn't be a lot of news. But that has just sort of gone away since 2016. And so now it feels like if you are away from social media, or if you're away from the news for even like an hour, and when you come back, you're like, what is everyone talking about? 2 hours ago, there was an entirely different situation that was happening and I don't even know where to start. And I'm scrolling, just try to find out what's happening. And that to me feels just so overwhelming and just entirely not healthy. And I'm sure you as psychologists can confirm that is not healthy for me to be constantly attached to the news and trying to figure out what is happening.
Yeah, that would be when either Deb or I would prescribe you to take a social media fast.
Yes. And that would probably be a really good idea. And I think social media, it's hard for us to imagine because it feels like it's such an ingrained part of our life. But you remember when like Facebook started, it wasn't that long ago. And on the political side of things, it really wasn't until the 2012 election, in terms of presidential elections, where candidates were using it in a widespread way. In 2016, really, where they were using it. So this is really one of our first elections where like everything is online, and because we're not in person with people, everything is happening online. And that's just, there's so much information coming at you at any one time, and you have to be able to filter through what's good and what's not good. And also, like you said, know when to just step away and go, I'm not even processing any of the information that I'm reading anymore. I'm just doing this because I somehow feel like I should be reading the news right now.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard to know what the right balance is because I don't like want to be completely ignorant of what's going on, because then that would be like you had mentioned previously, I probably could do that and my privilege would allow me to just kind of step back and completely be only mildly affected by kind of what's going on the larger scene. But that's not, that's not right, and that's not how it is for a lot of other people. So I've found myself, and I think Beth, you mentioned this too, like wondering what is kind of the best, most non-sensational way, like least panic-inducing way to get that information, but not do the doom scrolling. Like, I think that's the term Beth used earlier, where you're just like feeding your anxiety monster with article after article of people's like worst predictions of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Do you have any good resources, Chera, for that?
I think I do it too. So like this is sort of do as I say, not as I do. It's hard not to when we are just living all of our lives online. One of the things I really like is podcasts. There's a lot of really good political podcasts. Someone like NPR Politics, they put out weekly, and they'll do things for emergencies too, but a pretty regular diet of information. And that's a pretty unbiased source. They're going to be covering sort of the ins and outs. And, maybe take a walk and listen to your podcast when you can, since a lot of us aren't commuting for our jobs now. And same thing with like 538, they have a podcast that they'll put out on a weekly basis. And I think that those are, not going to be much longer than an hour perhaps. And that's a way for you to limit how much time you're spending and to hopefully be doing it while you're doing something else, so you're not entirely focused. Other than that, I think it really is thinking about how much to limit what you are looking at. Especially when it comes to social media, just to cut back as much as you can in terms of just reading everything that comes at you. So maybe finding a couple sources, preferably on even both sides of the aisle, right? Someone who's a more conservative voice, someone who's a more liberal voice. And so you can kind of see what both sides are arguing at any moment, but without getting like into their comments. That's always when it gets really dangerous, right? We're looking at all the replies to one of these.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's the worst part for sure. And I think that part of what you're distilling there is like mindfulness about it, instead of just kind of on autopilot. We're feeling anxious, we want to know what's going on, and then eventually like it leads us down the road to researching how to emigrate to Canada or something, like who will take us when all of this goes to heck, right? That's probably not as useful as like getting the information, allowing yourself time to process it in a healthy way, but like making choices instead of just going wherever your anxiety tells you to go.
And as we're getting closer to the election, one of the things that you can start doing is, instead of spending all your time just reading articles, is that start to make a plan for voting, right? Because that's going to feel very proactive for you. So here in Indiana, we're already early voting, right? So you actually could go out and cast your ballot already. You could help other people vote. So that would be, I think, kind of channeling some of that anxiety into a more productive task. Once you vote, one of the things people recommend is like find one other person who doesn't normally vote, but who's registered, and get them to plan how they're going to turn out to vote on election day. There's all kinds of different volunteer opportunities where you can work with campaigns. That might kind of just channel some of that anxiety into like a productive task that you can feel accomplished about at the end of the day, instead of being like, I just spent 12 hours on Twitter. That was not an accomplishment of any sort. So I think that might be also a good tool for people that I find to be more useful too.
I love, so I have two things that I was thinking about. I love the idea of a podcast or kind of listening to something so that I'm not tempted to just, have my phone in front of me and then quickly swipe to get to Facebook or quickly swipe to get to Instagram, or like, so
what is someone else saying about this right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I find myself sometimes when I get to the comments feeling just either this sense of anger about stupidity. I mean, that's honestly like where my head goes, or sort of hopelessness. Like what is my one vote going to do when we've got, this 100 people and these, 250 comments that are like, so clearly, so I wonder, I know I probably should have just stopped that sentence there.
No, well, and one of the things you're seeing a lot is a lot of conspiracy theories about like grand plans. And what I try to remember, I actually teach a class sometimes during the summer about conspiracy theories. And what we know about that, like psychologically, is that people turn to those when they feel a lack of control or they feel like at threat. And so I try to remember at the end of the day, like people responding for some reason do feel a threat or feel out of control, which is a feeling that I can empathize with in that moment, even if I cannot empathize or believe what is being said. So I try to remember that at the end of the day, like that is what's driving those kinds of feelings. And it makes me feel bad, right? That people are in such a headspace that that's really what they're turning to in this moment, over, kind of more appropriate news or information about the election.
Oh, yeah, I think that that's really awesome that you're able to do that. I don't think a lot of people have that kind of innate ability to step back and say, this idiot that believes X, Y, and Z, they're probably just scared and like hoping to gain some control, right? Like that's hard to do, but I think that from the idea of like social psychology, those types of feelings are really important to political parties who are wanting to control outcomes of things and like prey upon those emotions, because that's the easiest way to persuade someone is through that emotional route, not through logic or analysis or critical thinking. It's just like, what emotion can I get you to feel that will cause you to vote for me or not like this group or whatever it is that they're wanting.
I think we also are, I really believe that the reason this election feels so intense is because we are at a level of emotional fatigue from everything that's happened. So Deb, to your point, absolutely, right? These folks, it's their whole job to figure out how do we get people to make some emotional decisions at the polls. There's going to be a whole slew of us who are very logical thinkers, think this way. And there's also a whole slew of us that are just so overwhelmed with emotion and so tired of feeling overwhelmed that it's just like, forget it. I'm just going to pick because I saw one commercial that said this one thing that just ticked me off. And so I'm voting for the other person. So I think one other thing that I think about, and Chera would love to hear your thoughts, I hear people talk about, right, we have the presidential election, which is obviously all over the media, constant, kind of hanging over our head, I feel. But I've heard so many people say, like, your local government is really where things get done. And I think it's much less kind of nationally publicized. So where do you often send people to get information about local candidates so that people can make good decisions about local candidates? And frankly, I guess that's part one of the question. But then part two is, you hear people talk about like, make good decisions, go to the vote, like what's a good decision for voting, right? Like, how do you help people realize this is a good decision?
Yeah. So for the first one, absolutely. I just went to a couple first year seminar classes over the last couple of weeks and was trying to encourage young people to vote, because we know there's this huge gap, right? When you're 60 and older, like way over 85% of that age group votes, and it's a much smaller part of younger people's lives. And what you often hear is, I'm so fatigued. I don't want to hear any more about Trump Biden. I don't want to hear any more about this presidential election. Well, this year we have in Indiana, we have a race for governor, right? We have a race for some state legislative seats. We have a race for attorney general. And we always are going to have every 2 years a race for our House of Representative member, right? Those are all people who are making decisions for us on a much narrower range, right? And so I kind of point out someone like the attorney general asks, like, do you know what the attorney general does? And most people don't. Well, they're the chief legal officer for the state. So they're going to be making decisions about what court cases the state of Indiana signs on to, right? So if you care about abortion or gay marriage or healthcare or climate change, that person is going to have a lot of power to decide whether the state signs on to a case, submits a brief to the courts, all of that kind of stuff. But those races don't get much attention. And so that's when it's really, I do recommend, there's a couple sites. Vote 411 is a good one. You can just search for that. It's run by the League of Women Voters. That's a good nonpartisan source. They're going to have information about all the candidates. Ballotpedia is another good one. That's sort of like Wikipedia just for political things. And so they have pages about all of the different local and national issues that are on people's minds. But also, like, just to make a good decision in general, your brain can only process so much information, right? We just know that. And so in political science, we talk about using heuristics, right? Shortcuts to make your voting decision. And so I talk about people thinking about friends and family that they know they agree largely with on political issues, and having conversations with those people and asking them, who are you voting for? Why are you voting for that way? I guess you could also talk to people you disagree with and try to like triangulate where you disagree with that person and vote against them. But also lots of organizations about things that you care about put out slates of candidates who they're supporting. And that's also a potential good way, when you're just so overwhelmed with information, to go to some of those sources that you really trust and see who they're supporting. So a good example is something like Sierra Club. If you are really concerned about the environment and climate change, see who Sierra Club is endorsing and who they're supporting and why. They usually write up a little bit of information about why they're supporting that candidate, and you can get a good picture of that. Just again, there's so much information coming at you. You want to think about good, solid sources that you trust, and why you trust that source to go to them and find that information. But you're definitely not going to be able to process everything. So also just recognizing, like, what are the handful of things that I want to look at, and what do I most care about at the end of the day.
That's good. I'll be totally honest. I can't even think of a time where I've ever like sat with someone and said, hey, Deb, who are you voting for and why? Like that almost caused me to be like, and at the same moment, right? I mean, I think that's why we're having this conversation, right? Because after my initial like holy moment of like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine, because we put we put negative stuff with talking about politics, because we've all had conversations with people that just went batshit crazy on the conversation, and then we never want to do it again. And so I think, Deb, I would love to hear too, that idea of having open conversation is so important. We know that in all the work that we do, and yet it's terrifying.
But especially if you've not been socialized to it, right? Like you as psychologists know the power of socialization.
Yeah.
I grew up in a family. My dad was a union negotiator. Politics was a thing we talked about at the dinner table. It was not something that was uncomfortable for us, but that is probably an outlier experience. I think
yes.
They're like, we're not going to talk about politics and religion, right? Isn't that like the default that we're not going to talk about? So you're not alone in being uncomfortable about that. I was just raised in an environment like where we're going to talk about politics, right? And get used to it.
Yeah.
No, I think that we have so much like emotion and then judgment of other people when we're talking, it's hard to take other people's perspectives and understand why they believe what they believe, right? Like, what are the values that are their priorities that are underpinning their decisions that may be completely different from the values that I have prioritized in my life, but it doesn't mean that they're stupid, doesn't mean they're stupid or like wrong necessarily. We just have different ways of seeing the world. And sometimes it's hard to see how it isn't wrong, like when it's really the things they value are like hurting other people. But it's, again, I come back to like, there's a spin that every political side puts on their arguments, and those become the talking points and the things that the talking heads on the news talk about. And it's, the truth probably lies somewhere in between that. And if you can, like I was just talking about my husband, he's like, I don't want to know that this person that I like and admire at work supports this candidate for president, because now I just feel like I can't, like, how do I respect them knowing that they think this person is like a good choice? And I was like, you gotta, if you can't do it, then just don't talk about it. Like, focus on the things that you do respect and admire about this person, and like leave that for a different day, because ultimately you don't want to lose that relationship over something that you don't have the skill to like approach right now.
And I would say that like if there's really truly someone who is espousing views that are so fundamentally different to who you are or what you support, then I don't think you have to engage with that person. That to me that's like you have to also recognize that you need to save yourself and your mental well-being. And if a person does not see you as worthy of having rights or something like that, right, then that is not a person that you need to engage with. And it might not be a person, like in a workplace, it's hard because it's not like you're going to quit, but I don't know. I don't think that you have to continue to engage with someone just because like there's an idea that you should engage with that person. If it's really that fundamentally different, I think at some point, then I've become friends with people, I've ended friendships for a lot less, right, than fundamental differences in how I value human life. So I think that's also important to remind yourself of, that at some point a relationship might not be worth saving if there's really that wide of a difference.
And I come back to sometimes thinking, and I absolutely agree, like sometimes it's like, yeah, you just can't talk about certain things, and politics may be one of it, but other issues may be, things you just can't talk in that relationship with. But I also think about, valuing differences in other people. And I want other people to accept my differences, and then, million ways that I'm different from other people. And when I act differently and someone is like, why are you doing that? Then I'm mad at them, right? I'm like, well, I'm different and you have to accept my differences. But then when it comes to this, sometimes we're like, I just can't do this anymore because they're different from me. And really, I have to sometimes, and Deb, to your point earlier, it's like, I have to like intentionally pause my initial reaction of, I hate them and I want to, poke them with a fork. It's like, okay, they can be different and I can be different. And if I want them to treat me that way, I have to just accept their differences, and I have to kind of swallow that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, this is not my area, but like there's people that are studying sort of the genetic basis of your political views and like how some of this is filtered through your personality. Like there are just people who are fundamentally different than us, potentially like on a genetic level. So I think that's also something I remember, like, the way that some of these people are doing like highly sophisticated experiments measuring like heart rate and eye flickers and how they respond to different political stimuli, right? So it like people are just different on a very core level, and it just plays out in very different ways.
Yeah. So Deb.
Yes.
Some of us, I mean, I remember last election and the reaction that some of my clients had, and almost, I mean, I'd almost call it an emotional paralysis, right? Where they were just like so stuck. What are some signs that like folks could look out for? Like, I am not doing well. I probably need to do something to take care of myself. Like, what are some red flags of I need to take a break and do something else?
I mean, I think that the word that you use, stuck, is a key indicator that you maybe are not proactively, mindfully channeling whatever emotions are coming up for you into, like Chera was saying, something that feels productive, feels hopeful, feels helpful to the things that you care about. And instead, you're focusing on just like the overwhelming feeling. So I know I've teetered on that edge in this since March of this year, and have had to really kind of like pull myself back at several moments of like just mental self-talking myself through some of these scenarios of like, okay, you're maybe going out, like you're spending too much time reading what other people are thinking about this and listening to the doomsayers. And not that we need to just like close our eyes to everything that's going on, but it's just not productive or helpful to anyone if you just kind of fester in that politics juice. Yeah. So I would say, like, just engaging that mindfulness, right? Like, of how much time am I really spending on scrolling through Facebook and Twitter and whatever else it is that feeds that anxiety cycle? How do I feel at the end of that, of my scrolling? Is it helping me feel better about anything? No, probably not. And then deciding what mindful choices can I make to get myself through this feeling of anxiety.
Yeah, and I would add, sometimes the people around us are good temperature gauges for us. So if the people around us are saying, hey, you're kind of edgy, or you're, you've kind of been on your phone for a while, or you seem kind of distant, like our initial reaction to that is often going to be like, no, I'm not.
Mind your own business.
Which, by the way, is edgy. So anyway, but I think sometimes it's realizing that other people can sometimes see into how we're doing if we're so locked in, right? I sometimes talk about being overwhelmed with emotion similar to like drowning, right? Where you're like, you just feel like you're under the water and you're spinning and you're spinning and you're spinning and you can't find the surface to catch your breath. And sometimes there's people, outside of the water saying, come up for breath. We are here to help you. And we're just like, no, I'm just going to stay in here and stay in it. Whether we realize it or not, our actions by continually scrolling or turning on the news or, avoiding a conversation with someone who might help us because we're just still mad about what happened in the news that day or whatever. So I think that can sometimes also be an indicator for us. Chera?
Yeah, I mean, in 2016, I temporarily like deleted my social media, I think somewhere in mid-October, because I just was finding that I was so angry when I was scrolling, right? And that's not a healthy emotion to like be in for weeks on end, right? And so it was sort of popping up in other avenues of my life and being like, why, like, what is making me angry all the time? And it was like, oh, it was seeing everything on Facebook and very honestly, like seeing people who I agreed with politically say things that I was like, that's not how it works. For me, I was always like, that, like, I have some level of knowledge that other people don't have that can be very frustrating to see. And I was talking to someone about how I'm probably like a week away from deleting my social media until after the election, right? Just so that I can't continuously do that. And that won't mean that I tune out from news or other things. It'll mean I find more productive and less stressful ways for me to engage with the election. It's really, I think, being in tune with your emotions and figuring out what it is that is causing you the most stress and trying to eliminate that, or at least minimize your exposure to whatever that is.
Yeah, I do a lot of talking with folks about timing. So like if you find yourself in that edgy or angry state and you're just scrolling to kind of like numb out for a little bit, and then all of a sudden something pops up and then it like infuriates you, right? I talk with folks about sort of like picking a time where you have the emotional space to get angry, right? So like we can't control our emotions. We can control our behaviors that impact our emotions. And so when we scroll, sometimes it just, whether we like it or not, something pops up and then we get emotional. And so if we are intentional about how we choose that behavior of scrolling or checking your email or turning on the news or whatever, like wait until you have the emotional space to do that. If you're a person who's like, I can't shut it out, I'll get more anxious if I don't know, then you have the power to choose the time where you have the emotional space to do that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that like one thing I think we should do is just all go start a commune off the grid. And like,
that's practical.
I think that is the solution. If you guys are into it, then I've already got kind of a rough sketch worked out.
Well, first we should all talk about who you're voting for and who you're not voting for and why.
And then we can decide who's allowed into the commune.
I love this idea, actually. I totally do. I mean, I really want to have this conversation because I am probably the least political person on this call. That's for sure. I don't watch the news. I don't really scroll social media. I barely know, the branches of government. I just I don't have space in my brain for these things, and that, to Deb, your point earlier, like that's my privilege that I can do that. But yeah, so I think having conversations with other people is such a great idea.
Yeah. And I mean, there is a lot of good on social media too. I don't want to spend this whole time being like, it's awful and you should all sign out. There are a lot of, not to pitch, but there's a lot of very smart political scientists and psychologists who are talking about elections and who can filter out what is the noise and what is serious things that we should be paying attention to. And that's also one thing that I have done is really, I know, like they say, you should have this wide range of people that you follow. I've been more careful about curating, right? People who I trust and who have expertise, right? So I have people who are expertise in the presidency, who I follow very closely. And when they're raising an alarm about something that's happening, then I go, oh, I should also be concerned about this because this is an expert in this area saying that there's an issue. People who talk about misinformation and conspiracy theories, same thing. They're raising an issue. And then sometimes they're like, that's not a big deal. Or, what we know in the research is this doesn't really matter in the way that people are talking about. So I think that that's also like, if you are going to be on social media, think about who it is you're following and the sources that you're seeking out. And try to find, right, like you can follow news people and you can follow pundits, but also try to find some of those people who have a level of expertise to help you interpret that news. Again, like relying on heuristics of, I can't process everything on my own. So who can I turn to help process all of this information that's coming at me?
So what I hear you saying is that I shouldn't get all my information and opinions from the Joe Rogan podcast and show, or is he an expert?
Just like you shouldn't get it all from Pod Save America, right? Or There's been an explosion of sort of partisan news sources, which that's fine, right? I think that it's useful to have news sources that have your same ideological background and your same political background, because they are going to provide you with information that is useful to you, right? And they're going to raise issues that are useful to you, and they're going to alert you to politicians who you maybe have never heard of that also are in line with your views. But I think that it's important to also have either that you sort of are exposed to people on the other side, or you're exposed to sources that are in the middle. And I know that the media gets a lot of a bad rap right now, but organizations like CBS and ABC and NBC, they're pretty middle of the road, right? They are, their biggest concern is getting the widest audience possible, which means that they have to be appealing to the widest amount of people possible. And they're producing news sort of in the middle. I turn to BBC sometimes, right? Because that's an entirely outside source who's looking at our system and going like, what's happening right now? And that can also be useful to have those outside voices being like, you guys are crazy right now, or this, I guess, why are you making such a big deal out of this issue? So I think that's also really useful, is having a wide perspective that you are exposed to. Yes, but don't get all your news sources from one podcast.
Well, I was just thinking about that, like getting information from experts who actually know what they're talking about, rather than just like some guy who has provocative ideas on the internet but has never like studied one day in his life about the thing he's giving an opinion about, right? And I think there's such a rise of that because, again, it plays on people's emotions, and people like to think that they listen to the everyman voice, right? But it's like, experts know things that there's no way that this person could know or understand, like at a depth that is really important. Yeah.
And we saw that a lot, I think, during COVID. Same thing, right? Like, are you an epidemiologist or like a public health person, or just like someone random, right? And so who do I need to listen to? Probably people who have worked with infectious disease in the past and like know how these diseases are spread, as opposed to someone who, again, even you might be a nurse or a doctor, but that is not your area of expertise, right? And so really just paying attention to the sources that you are exposed to. And even if they have a PhD, right? Like I have a PhD, it's not like I'm going to go around and counsel people or do clinical psychology, right? That's not my expertise. So, a degree doesn't just necessarily matter. It's really like what their area of focus is.
Yeah.
So a very practical question for folks who are out there, like I absolutely relate to this idea of finding an expert. It makes total sense. I'd never thought about from a political side, thinking about experts and researchers from a political view, right? If I had a family member who had diabetes, I would search up diabetes doctors, right? Like I would want an expert in diabetes for I would search that up. Very nonpartisan, searching it up. So I am curious, Chera, how would a person find an expert who is like, how would you go through searching for someone who would have that level or that type of expertise? Would you do the same thing, like presidential political scientist?
So there's a couple of really good resources, and unfortunately for white men, they're not going to be included in this list of things. So there are white male experts on some of these things, but so there are two sources in political science that are very useful. The first is a website called Women Also Know Stuff. I think it's womenalsoknowstuff.com. It's an organization that was started by a group of women who were tired of seeing only men quoted in political stories as experts. And so they created this database basically of women, where women and women people who identify as women could add their profiles to this website and where their areas of expertise are. So you can go on this website and you can search for presidential politics, or you could search for Indiana politics, and it's going to narrow you down, and they're going to have links to those people's social media, the things that they've written. So that's one good source. And there's also an equivalent for people of color. I think it's POC Also Know Stuff. Search for that again. It's the same kind of model. But again, kind of tired of only white experts being quoted. And so they created this website. And I know this model is expanded. There's examples in history, right? And historians can provide us with very useful information about that as well. So there are some of these like landing pages where they are trying to make sure that there's a diverse group of experts available to people. A lot of times, at IU, we have a speakers bureau and we can be added as experts there. So that's another place you can search. And again, same kind of things that you would look out for other places. Make sure that these are legitimate experts, that they have, EDU websites, that they have a record of expertise in their particular area. And that's a good source for them. But those two websites are really useful for finding political science experts in lots of different areas.
That's great. Yeah. Any last thoughts that we have as we kind of wrap up? Deb, your mind is blown. I mean, you've literally blown out all of the mind that has been blown.
My big thing is make a plan, right? Like, if you are registered to vote, we're unfortunately in Indiana and Ohio after that deadline, but you have plenty of time to vote. And I think that's a very productive thing that you can do, right? Like plan when you're going to vote, where you're going to do it, and then turn to people who you know and ask them to create a plan, right? And so that's, again, like very productive thing. And if you are feeling even more like you want to be doing something, there's lots of organizations that need help. You can volunteer for political campaigns. A lot of them are doing things like text banking now. So you don't even have to leave your house, or they're having you write postcards. So there's lots of ways for you to get involved and like be doing something to help your preferred candidate get elected. And I think that is something you can channel all your anxiety into, at least in this moment.
Yeah, and even if it's not like helping your candidate, it could be helping a cause that you care about really deeply, like volunteering or things like that. Oh man, I had a thought, but now I can't think of it anymore. Sorry.
That's because your mind is blown.
It's not even present anymore. Sorry.
Well, I think this has been a really fun episode of the Beth and Deb Show. I'm so glad that Chera has joined us and shared all of your expertise. Thank you so much for being here. And until next time, we will see y'all later.